I'm Tom McCoy, current Vice President of the Mycological Association of Washington, D.C. And let me turn on my laser pointer before I forget. And what a pleasure, an absolute pleasure it is to be speaking with you tonight. Tonight's talk is the first in a series I'm hoping to do on famous women of science, including, in addition to Beatrix Potter, Mary Elizabeth Banning, Maryland's most famous mycologist, and Rachel Carson, the famous author and conservationist who is equally claimed by both her birth state of Pennsylvania and Maryland, where she resided as an adult. Well, Rachel is not famous for mycology. One of my future objectives for MAUDC, I hope, is to spend some more focus on conservation issues. And one of the ways we can do that is through environmental education, teaching people about the environment so they're more invested in it, which falls under that large umbrella of conservation. If you understand nature, even to a small degree, you want to preserve it. And if you don't understand nature, chances are it's not a priority. It's hard to care deeply about an abstraction. That said, what I'm hoping to do, is give another short talk about Rachel next year and couple it with a walk at Rachel Carson Park or Rachel Carson Greenway, or most likely the site of the future Rachel Carson Museum, which will be near the Trader Joe's on Colesville Road, ideally on Earth Day 2024. So stay tuned. Back to tonight's topic as we discuss one of the most successful artistic persons of all time, Beatrix Potter, a phenomenally talented artist and storyteller who, had she been able to paraphrase the great Gary Linkoff, would have dedicated her life to studying mushrooms, instead of being the creative force behind so many enduring children's tales. Who amongst us hasn't heard of Flopsy, Mopsy, Cottontail, and last but certainly not least, the mischievous Peter Rabbit? Let's begin with Beatrix Potter, tale of a Victorian age would-be mycologist, or perhaps I should say, once upon a time. Helen Beatrix Potter was born in London on July 28, 1866. First child of an upper middle class family of considerable means, in a time when Great Britain led the world. Empires spanned the globe. It was the 28th year of Queen Victoria's 63 years of steady leadership as head of state, and the industrial age was transitioning to the age of science. Darwin's little book was published just 7 years before. It was an exciting and enlightening time, especially if you were lucky enough to be someone of means. Then it was a very good time indeed to be British. The Potters were people of means. As was typical of families like the Potters in this era, children were largely raised by domestic staff, and their house would have been occupied by a collection of cooks, maids, footmen, and the like. Children were meant, in large part, to be seen and not heard, with their education being, in the main, done by staffed positions. In Beatrix's case, this job would have been done by a governess, and she had 3 of them during her formative years, the last of which was Annie Moore, who was just 3 years older than Beatrix. Despite that short age difference, they became lifelong friends, and Annie would later play a role in Beatrix's decision to become a professional artist and storyteller. The Potters did not permit other children to visit very often, which meant that aside from time dedicated to formal study, large parts of the day for her and her younger brother Bertram were left unoccupied. To fill those many hours, Beatrix developed a keen interest in the visual arts at an early age, filling countless sketchbooks attempting to render her many pets in perfect replica. Throughout Beatrix's formative years, she and her brother Bertram kept many, many pets. not only as companions for the idle hours, but to study and draw. There were rabbits, of course, but the menagerie contained other more exotic pets, including mice, hedgehogs, lizards, frogs, canaries, guinea pigs, and, of all things, bats. Beatrix loved them all dearly. And while it seems odd in modern times, in Victorian England, exotic pets were popular and could be easily acquired. The most famous shop in this trade was Jamrach's Animal Emporium. And if you had the money, you could buy anything there, even a tiger per se. Jamrach's is where the famous painter Dante Rossetti, who I'll mention again in a moment, would buy the wombats he used to keep his pets. And the author Rudyard Kipling bought a giant pet toad there that he named Pluto. While Beatrix loved her pets dearly, she was no shrinking violet. And after they died, she would personally perform taxidermy on them in order to understand the underlying anatomy so as to better draw them. This love of the visual arts is where the guiding hand of her father served her well, as Rupert Potter was a great amateur artist, and his steady encouragement allowed her to develop her future craft. Rupert Potter was the son of the successful industrialist Edmund Potter, and while Rupert did initially study law, along with sporting a glorious set of mutton chops, he soon left the legal profession to focus his attention on his pastimes. Rupert Potter inherited enough wealth and was a savvy enough investor. He didn't have to work, and so he simply chose not to. While Beatrix had a warm and loving relationship with her father, likely because of their shared passion for the visual arts and nature, she didn't have quite the same affectionate bond with her mother. Helen Potter also came from a wealthy family and dedicated her life to managing the household staff and entertaining. She was known as being a rather humorless, controlling woman, as you might guess from that photo. And perhaps this is the reason for her and her daughter's more distant relationship. Rupert's occupation was his hobbies, especially hunting and fishing with other gentlemen of means. And he was also passionate about the arts, in particular photography, a technology that was still in its infancy. Rupert's talent as an amateur photographer, as well as membership in social clubs dedicated to the visual arts, brought him into close contact with many professional artists. Most notable amongst them was John Everett Millais, one of the greats in the history of painting, and a close personal friend. John Everett Millais was an English painter, illustrator, and co-founder of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood in 1848. Talented group of painters, poets, and art critics dedicated to reversing what they saw as the corrupting influences of artifice and contrived compositions that began, in their opinion, during the High Renaissance, specifically with the great Raphael, hence the name, the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. In their charter, they emphasized the artist needs to develop a deep understanding of nature and its accurate depiction. And I believe those ideals were conveyed to and held tremendous value in the mind of the young Beatrix Potter. In a general sense, European art at this time was transitioning from the age of Romanticism to the age of realism. And if you're unfamiliar with my many artistic turns of phrase and I talk about mushrooms, allow me to digress. Romanticism in European art was a style that depicted nature as being sublime and perfect, even more perfect than nature itself. And it became popular because of the cumulative destructive effects of the Industrial Revolution that had on the environment. In other words, it was a yearning for paradise lost. But by the middle of the 1800s, this style had lost its appeal, and thus the era of realism began with a focus on depicting scenes, especially nature, as it is, not as the artist imagined it should be. Here is a Malay painting showing a young Jesus in his father, St. Joseph's workshop, a highly controversial painting in its time. And in the art world, little controversy is a good thing because it's free advertising. Charles Dickens, who was at the height of his popularity, wrote a scathing critique of it because the painting is very realistic, especially compared to traditional church iconography. It was scandalous and called blasphemous, which got the pre-Raphaelites noticed. Again, in the art world, a bit of controversy is a very good thing. And this painting was the catalyst for the Brotherhood's success. Well, the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood subscribed to the ideal of realism and practice, they often romanticized their work with scenes of ancient cultures interjected with symbolism. By example, here's a painting I just absolutely love by another member of the Brotherhood, Dante Rossetti, the proud owner of wombats. And it's a painting of Persephone from Greek mythology. And I think it is just magnificent. I use it in another talk I have on ergot, so I'm not going to linger on it here. I only mention it now to reintroduce the name Dante Rossetti and illustrate my point about symbolism and ancient cultures. And to close our tangent on art history and the pre-Raphaelites, we return to John Everett Millais and his most famous painting called Ophelia, which is a scene from Shakespeare's Hamlet, where the young Ophelia is driven mad by grief after Hamlet killed her father. In the scene, Ophelia was picking wildflowers when she accidentally fell into a river and drowned. And her madness is so acute that she's singing while being pulled under the cold water, surrounded by her freshly picked flowers. This was Beatrix's favorite Millais painting and said it was probably one of the most marvelous pictures in the whole world. Flowers are often symbolic in art, hence notice that poppy right there, provider of opium and symbolic of sleep and death. Thus, it's well placed in this work. Millais was praised for his accurate representation of nature in this scene, but it didn't come easy. The artist spent months working outdoors to capture the details of this brookside scene. And that's it, really, because the best in art and the best in science is achieved through quiet observation. That's when he told a young Beatrix, plenty of people can draw, but you have observation. That was a compliment of the very first order. Further drive home that point on the intersection of art and science and observation, below I've included a quote by the great Leonardo da Vinci. Now, enough digression on art history and back to Beatrix's story. During her formative years, Beatrix showed little affection for her birthplace of London, but to escape the summer heat, Potters would go on extended vacations to rural Scotland, and this is where she found a sense of place, surrounded and immersed in nature. In her late teens, she met a young vicar there named Canon Hardwicke Rawnsley, one of the founding fathers of the conservation movement in England, and also a former art student of another pre-Raphaelite, the famous art critic John Ruskin. And Hardwicke's ideas on conservation, along with the pastoral life of the Lake District, had so much appeal to the young Beatrix that it would eventually become her passion, her home, her identity, and her legacy. But I am getting a little bit ahead of myself. As Beatrix passed into her 20s, her formal education complete, and virtually no access to higher education available to women in England at the time, and no prospects for marriage either. Sadly, that was the default path for young women of the age. She dedicated herself to her nature studies and in earnest. Her interests were wide-ranging, including animals, of course, and geology. I like that part. But she was most fascinated by fungi. Perhaps it was their unique colors that appealed to her artistic sense, but for whatever reason, she wanted more than to just draw and paint them. She wanted to understand them. She wanted something meaningful to do with her life, which led her to reach out to Charles Mackintosh, a self-trained Scottish naturalist. His story reminds me of something I once read by Bill Bryson, the author, the great author, in my opinion, of A Walk in the Woods, in a book he wrote about England, when he said, "One of the most enduring charms of this land is one can find expertise in places where you wouldn't expect it. Your cab driver might be a leading expert on dragonflies, per se." Having never visited England, I have no idea whether or not there's any validity to this, but I like to believe there is, because I find it charming. And the tale of Charles Mackintosh lends support to Bill's assertion. Charles Mackintosh started life working in a sawmill, but an accident at the age of 18 left him without any fingers on his left hand. Unable to continue working at the mill, he found employment as a rural postman, where he spent the rest of his working life. In spite of lacking any formal training, he became fascinated by the flora and fauna, and especially the mushrooms on his long rural circuit. He would become an enthusiastic member of the local Natural Science Society and identified 13 new species of fungi. Seems an unlikely partnership given the age and gender differences, but whenever Beatrix sought him out for assistance to better learn her precious mushrooms, she soon found common ground on their mutual love of nature and complementary strengths. As Charles had a great deal of knowledge but little artistic talent, while Beatrix was untrained with vast artistic talent, as can be witnessed in the watercolors over here. To my eye, her paintings of fungi are some of the finest botanical art I've ever witnessed. They testify to her discipline and desire to merge the science and the beauty while revealing the truth of both. She and Charles had a warm yet professional working relationship for many years, as he provided steady instruction and new samples for her to illustrate. It's widely believed that Mr. McGregor, that gardener who so wanted to put Peter Rabbit in a stew pot, was modeled after Charles Mackintosh. During this period, when Beatrix inherited a microscope from her brother Bertram and began to better understand fungal microscopy, while examining the spores on the basidia of a Solilus granulatus in 1896, she asked herself, "I wonder if these spores could germinate. How did they overwinter? In what form did they reappear?" And oddly enough, few mycologists at the time had given these questions any thought. And thus she made the transition from illustrator to amateur mycologist. But in order to answer these questions, she needed to speak with the professional mycologists at Kew Gardens. With Charles Mackintosh's help and encouragement, Beatrix gained an intense fascination with how mushrooms reproduce, something very poorly understood at the time, and soon began conducting her own experiments with spores she germinated herself. She was quite captivated by lichens too, which I am as well. And they were considered at the time, in the words of the great botanist Carl Linnaeus, the poor peasants of the plant world. A statement which underlies the complete lack of scientific understanding and respect. For lichens are not plants, but rather a hybrid organism of primarily fungi and sequestered algae or cyanobacteria. The hybrid nature of lichens was first proposed by Swiss botanist Simon Schwendener in 1869 and believed by absolutely no one for decades. The idea was so laughable to the mainstream scientific community that calling somebody a Schwendenerist was a form of mockery. But Beatrix's observations and experiments convinced her that the Swiss botanist had a valid point with his dual organism hypothesis, and thus put her theories and empirical data from her own experiments on fungal reproduction and lichens in a scientific paper accompanied by her finely detailed illustrations. When the paper was first presented to the Kew Gardens, the director, William Turner Thistleton Dyer, rejected it flat out with little consideration, calling her ideas unimportant. Although her paper has been lost to history, we know her observations and conclusions, albeit incomplete and amateurish, had scientific merit from the many notes and daily journals she kept. There were formidable socio-cultural forces working against her, though, for Thistleton Dyer was an autocratic leader and misogynist who would have had little patience for a formal scientific work submitted by a rank amateur and a female. Barring women from scientific work was the norm in Britain then. And even the London Linnean Society, which contained the most important botanical scientists, barred women from membership, denied them access to the research library, and wouldn't allow them to attend presentations of scientific papers. Beatrix, however, had one final card to play, for she had an uncle who was politically connected and a well-respected scientist, and he took it upon himself to see her paper presented at the Linnean Society. Since she was female, she wasn't able to attend her own presentation, but we indirectly know from other sources it landed with a soft thud, was regarded as not worthy of consideration, and was quietly withdrawn. And so we turn the page on this chapter on the would-be mycologist in the tale of Beatrix Potter. While Beatrix was never to have children of her own, she adored them. And a chance remark by her former governess, Annie Moore, during the years she was devoted to fungi, opened the next chapter. In 1893, in order to cheer up Annie's son, Noel, who was suffering from an extended illness, she sent him a picture letter about a disobedient rabbit named Peter. It began with, "I don't know what to write to you, so I shall tell you a story about 4 little rabbits whose names were Flopsy, Mopsy, Cottontail, and Peter." At the time, Beatrix was engaged with mycology studies, but in the year 1900, Annie recalled the story and suggested she turn it into a children's book. Searching for an identity after her failed attempt at the Linnean Society, and more so her own income, and with it, independence from her ever more controlling parents, Beatrix visited 7 firms in total before she found one willing to publish the tale of Peter Rabbit in 1902, and the timing could not have been better, for it coincided with the beginning of the era of mass market book publishing, and she was an overnight success. Mycology was now a thing of the past, as all of her formidable creative and inquisitive energies were focused on her new vocation, which included merchandising. Man, it seems odd, but at the time, merchandising products associated with a popular story simply wasn't done. Yet Beatrix was the first to recognize how profitable it could be, so she designed and patented her own line of products, like this famous Peter Rabbit doll. With a new book or 2 every year and income from merchandising, she soon became independently wealthy and relocated to the town of Near Surrey in the Scottish Lake District in 1905, where she had spent so many enjoyable summer vacations and loved dearly. Although she would go on to publish a few more tales, by the year 1909, she had transitioned to a full-time country farmer and landowner with clear ideas about country life and the environment. She married a local solicitor named William Peelis in 1913, and it was a good marriage in all aspects. She She had at long last become very wealthy, very content, and her own woman. As steady income poured in from the sale of her books and merchandise, she focused her considerable resources towards the land conservation and preservation ideals of her longtime friend and mentor, Carnan Hadwick Rawnsley, whom I mentioned earlier. Hardwick was the founding member of the National Trust, a group dedicated to heritage conservation. And although it seems odd for me to say, in the year 1895, when this group was formed, land and heritage conservation were very novel and very progressive, liberal ideas. Beatrix slowly purchased neighboring farms whenever they went up for sale with the intention of conserving them. Some things are worth saving, she said, and you can still visit her estate today, preserved in a snapshot of time, because when she passed away in 1943, she bequeathed its 4,000 acres to the National Trust. As per her wishes, when Beatrix passed away, she had no funeral ceremony, no headstone, and her ashes were scattered in secret on her property. In other words, no fuss. Her legacy is legion, though, with 23 published children's tales making names like Peter Rabbit, Miss Tiggywinkle, and Jemima Puddle Duck household names. Her books are as relevant today as in her own time, with annual sales of $2 million, an international fan base, and 100,000 visitors annually to her National Trust estate. Born in the age of steam and dying in the atomic age, little did the scientific community know when they rejected her work on mycology that they were doing her a favor, unknowingly providing an outlet for her formidable creative energy and one of the most active imaginations of all time, which in turn permitted her to live one of the most remarkable lives ever lived. Rejection was a blessing in this case, and Beatrix lived happily ever after. The end.